welcome back, everyone, to the Jerusalem Fund. And on behalf of our board of directors, I'm very happy to have you all here today for this important discussion. And before we get into the subject of today's talk, I just want to make a couple of announcements about upcoming events that we have here. As some of you may know, recently the Foreign Secretary of England was in Palestine, and for the first time, a high-ranking official met with some members of the what's called the Popular Nonviolent Resistance, which was sort of an important benchmark for that movement. And many of you may have also heard of the film Budros, and on your way out or on your way in, you may have noticed that there is these handouts about the film, which is screened in town currently, and we're sponsoring, along with a number of other organizations, a screening tonight, and that's going to be at 7 p.m. at the West End Cinema, and of course all the information is on this handout here. And speaking of the Popular Resistance, next week on the 9th, November 9th, at the same time slot as this event, we have Joseph Dana, who's a journalist and a blogger who covers these types of resistance movements, particularly those against the wall and against the encroachment on Palestinian homes and livelihood in Jerusalem. So I'd encourage you all to check out that event, and that should really be a great and timely discussion. Of course, on November 18th, we have a book event at 6:30 p.m. With Layla Haddad, the mother from Gaza, who's doing a talk about her recently released book about being a mother from Gaza and what it's like to raise kids and live with the situation there, the political situation, also just daily life. And then on December 11th, we have our annual soup here. So there's plenty of information on that outside. And if you have any questions, of course, you can see any of the staff here. For today's event, which is on Islamophobia and anti-Arab sentiment in the United States, given everything that happened this summer between the discussion around the Park 51 project, the Quran burning that we saw that was supposed to happen on September 11th, and the amount of what really became regular anti-Arab, anti-Muslim rhetoric in the mainstream media to an extent that I don't think we've ever seen before. It became clear to us that this was an issue that we had to address here, and I'm glad to welcome two great speakers and experts on this topic. Seated immediately to my left is Professor Yvonne Haddad. She's a professor of History of Islam and Christian-Muslim Relations at the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. And her fields of expertise include 20th century Islam, intellectual and social or political history of the Arab world, and Islam in North America and the West. And currently she's conducting research on Muslims in the West and on Islamic revolutionary movements. She teaches courses as well on Muslim-Christian relations and Arab intellectuals. Dr. Jim Zogby, seated next to her, is the author of the newly released Arab Voices, which was just released in October, and he's the founder and president of AAI, the Arab American Institute, a DC-based organization which serves as the political and policy research arm of the Arab American community. He received his doctorate from Temple University in 1975 in religion, and he studied under the Islamic scholar Dr. Ismail al-Faruqi. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers today, and I will turn it over to Jim, did you want to go first? Go ahead.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming to hear this presentation, and for those of you watching it as it's being streamed, welcome. It is an important discussion, and I think it's great that we're having it today, especially in the wake of this congressional election, which I think will weigh heavy on many of us for the next couple of years. Let me say that the situation that exploded this summer should have been expected and was in some ways foretold by a series of events leading up to the summer. Obviously, all beginning with 9/11. What was interesting to me was that if you study social organization and social organism, you understand that when an organism, a social organism, receives pressure from an external source, it reacts in multiple ways. I made the point after 9/11 that the woman next door to my office who came over one day teary-eyed and said, "I've got these brownies. I know your folks must be afraid. I want to see what I can do to help." That her genuine act of kindness was as undeserved as the calls that came that said, "You Arabs must die." But what they were symptoms of an organization, an organism, a social organism that was under tremendous stress. The good side of America reacted one way. The people who reacted the other way represented a different sort of strand of American life and American behavior. The president at the time, George Bush, made a really important contribution to this sort of organism in trauma by putting a lid on it and saying, Islam's not the enemy. We must not do this. And it almost became a definition of American patriotism to be good to Arabs and Muslims. It was the way he framed it and the way then the media that actually had helped contribute to anti-Arab sentiment turned it around. I remember the CBS did a big special after 9/11 where they had music and all kinds of Hollywood performers and everything. And we called to say, we want to see, will you include some messages about Muslims and Arabs and not being bigoted, etc. They said, oh, we already had that taken care of. And they had U2 and others making these appeals. They spontaneously reacted that way. The Ad Council of America did advertisements on we are all American and don't target this group or that group. By the time you got to the Democratic Convention, one of the lines that many of us will never forget, Barack Obama in his address, speaking about identifying with Arabs after 9/11. It was an extraordinary time to see America, the good side, react that way. But a lot of questions were being asked, and people were still afraid. The problem, as I frame it, is that people had the question, and who was supplying the answer? And the Arab side was not supplying the answer. I mean, those of our organizations were too small. We did what we could. We had literature at the time that we produced for the Department of Education and for the NEA and AFT, the American Federation of Teachers and the National Education Association, that everything from Casey Kasem's famous Arab Americans to the contribution of Arabs to Western civilization, etc. And we distributed hundreds of thousands of material like that across the country. But we were not able to overcome the incredible role that was being played by that cottage industry of terrorism experts who spread anti-Arab and Islamophobic poison. And they were everywhere. And they were well-funded. And they did incredible work. And it was, in a sense, unchallenged. We were defending ourselves, but they were on the offense. And in some ways, I don't know if you saw that film Obsession that was circulated at the Democratic and Republican conventions and mailed to millions of American households. That was sort of the culmination of the effort. It was sort of it was all the pieces come together in a film that was distributed very, very widely. I remember when we first started polling on this issue right after 9/11, we got not dissimilar attitudes than we had gotten pre-9/11 in terms of favorable, unfavorable to Arabs and Muslims. The numbers weren't great, but they weren't a whole lot different than the numbers for Buddhism and Hinduism. I mean, it was foreign and strange, and therefore you weren't going to get overwhelming favorables, but you weren't getting significant unfavorables. The most interesting number for me was, do you need to know more? And we would get 3/4 saying, yes, I do. And I want to know more. And if someone came to your community, would you want to meet them? And the answer was, oh, yes, I would. If a Muslim came or an Arab leader came, I'd love to meet them and find out more. Most recent poll we did this year, asking these questions, favorable, unfavorable toward Arabs. I'm not going to give you the overall number. It's dropped. It's dropped rather significantly. From about a 50-something favorable, 20 unfavorable, to an almost split 43 favorable, 41 unfavorable, the overall. But here's the one I want you to look at. Democrats in this poll, 57% favorable toward Arabs, 30% unfavorable. Republicans, 28% favorable, 66% unfavorable. Toward Muslims, Democrats, 54% favorable, 34% unfavorable. Republicans, 12% favorable, 85% unfavorable. Now, what has accounted for that? What's done that? Well, here are the threads. Number one, you start with the religious right, which has now become home to about 40% of Republican voters identify with being born-again Christian. More serious than the Tea Party is the continuing presence of the religious right and the leaders of that movement. I remember I mentioned recently something about Pat Robertson, and it was dismissed as he's just a crackpot. He's a crackpot who has a television show and a multi-million-dollar enterprise that is watched by millions of people, and he was one of the single largest financial supporters, he and his family and his corporation, of Bob McDonnell's victory in Virginia, and seated front row, in the audience at the inauguration. I mean, this is a crackpot, but he's a crackpot who actually has a role to play in political power on the Republican side. And Gary Bauer and what's his name? And William Hagee, Christians United for Israel. These are rather massive organizations and leaders with followers who actually listen to them. When you believe, as they do, that the end is at hand and the forces of good must defeat the forces of evil, and the forces of evil are defined as Islam and the Arabs, and the forces of good are America and Christianity and Judaism. Well, it's rather Islamophobia does not follow far behind. One might say they theologize Islamophobia, or that Islamophobia is a logical extension of their religious ideology. And I say ideology, not belief system, because it's more than a belief. It is a certitude. They are absolutely convinced of the righteousness of their belief. Now, the secular version of them, which is neoconservatism, and that's all it is just a secular version of Christian fundamentalism. I mean, they both believe in a Manichaean world. They both believe in the inevitability of conflict between good and evil. They both believe in the inevitability of the victory of good over evil. And they believe in kind of an apocalyptic ending where it's unpredictable. We don't know exactly how it happens, but when the two clash, good will win. And that was the Iraq mindset, creative chaos, shock and awe, and everything falls in place. Well, it didn't quite work out that way, but that was their mindset. But they are ideological cousins, and they both form and have a significant role to play in Republican Party thinking. There is, in addition to that now, this Tea Party current, which is not itself a coherent ideology, but has in some ways developed a nativist streak, which I think is a dangerous part of the movement. The sort of the anger, the angst, the fear that motivates this movement. And when President Obama said that recently and was chided for saying the American people are afraid, but he wasn't half wrong. I mean, he was completely right, I would suggest, not half wrong, he wasn't wrong at all. When I looked in the faces of those folks at those healthcare meetings that they went to, this was not a a coherent ideology that was motivating people. It was, as we now know, it's a middle class, middle age, largely white movement. And what's it about? It's about people who are experiencing everything from home foreclosures and collapse of their pension and fear of loss of retirement and therefore for the future, and a sense, maybe the first time in American history, that a generation of middle-class people do not believe that their children will even live the same standard of living that they do. The collapse of the American dream is itself a huge trauma. This loss of control, this loss of a sense of where the future is going to take me, no doubt gives birth to the anxiety that produces this movement. When you throw into the mix a young, articulate black president, whoa, you got a problem here for some folks. They can't wrap their arms around that. It's not surprising when John Boehner talks about, remember Ronald Reagan when we had, Bob Hope and Johnny Cash? It's white. It's an image of a kind of a past we knew and we understood and we were comfortable with. And things are changing now. We got Mexicans coming. We got a black president with a funny name. And we've got Muslims. And they're going to build a mosque near where? The most sacred ground, blah, blah, blah. You put all that together and you get this reaction. And it's taken a toll. It's taken a toll on attitudes. And it's taken a partisan toll, a divide, a deep divide, almost as deep as the gay marriage divide. And it's taken a toll in terms of people's sense of certitude. For example, when we now ask the question, do you know enough? Or do you need to know more? Among Democrats, 68% say they'd like to know more about Islam. 80% say they'd like to know more about Arabs. Among Republicans, 71% say they do not want to know more about Islam. And 58% say they do not want to know more about Arabs. President Obama's outreach to the Muslim world, which was immediately confronted by Republicans back when it happened, I know because I was debating these characters at the time. I was asked after one of the shows, did I think that the president could heal the divide? I said he'll have an easier time healing the divide with the Muslim world than he will with conservatives here who won't give him a break. But do Democrats approve of the president's outreach? 82% do. Republicans, 73% disapprove. So it is not surprising to me that we get the partisan divide and then we get, therefore, the kind of ideological bent that we're getting with the Congress, the new Congress that comes in. Now, I've used up much of my time in that background, and I hope you don't mind. I wanted to lay the framework or the background for it. But the new Congress in the relevant committees is really quite problematic. From Elena Ross-Laitman to Dan Burton, who will respectively chair the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the Middle East Subcommittee, to Peter King, who will chair Homeland Security, or Lamar Smith, who will chair Judiciary, or Steve King, who will chair the Immigration Committee. You have people who have a decidedly anti-Arab and anti-Muslim mindset that is not born of practical politics, but is born of the same kind of ideological fervor that we saw among those in the last administration and in the public as at large. I mean, one funny story about Steve King that indicates the degree to which he's a little off the wall. He's the immigration guy now. A couple of years back, there was a debate about passing a piece of legislation to give honorary citizenship to a Polish war hero who fought in the Revolutionary War, a general who fought, Kazimierz Pulaski, who came from Poland. He was one of those, like General von Steuben and Pulaski and others were ones who came from Europe to support the American Revolution. he opposed it because it provided general amnesty for someone and said it would set a precedent that would be dangerous for today's illegal immigrants. He's rather rigid. He objected to Barack Obama taking the oath of office using his middle name, said it was anti-American. He opposed Keith Ellison's using the Quran. He said somebody should find him a Bible. He's got no business using that. He referred to it as a foreign book. These are problematic people, and I think the only thing that's good here is that because nothing's going to pass this Congress or be passed by Congress and the Senate, we will not see a repeat of the situation we saw back in the 1990s, where what happened was the president had put on his desk the PLO Compliance Act, the Iraq Liberation Act, the Jerusalem Embassy Relocation Act, the Religious Freedom Bill, etc. All of those things sort of in veto-proof form put the president in a position where he either had to sign or face an override in Congress, and Clinton usually took the path of signing. These things won't, they're not going to go through the Senate, is the bottom line here. But will Congress be difficult? Absolutely. Will Ross Leighton try to put more burdens on an already burdened American foreign policy? Absolutely. Will we see anti-Muslim legislation in the Immigration and Judiciary Committee? Absolutely. Peter King, I mean, this is a problem at Homeland Security. He's already called for an investigation into Faisal Abdul Rauf. He thinks there's too many mosques in America. We don't need any more. But again, he does not have the force of law because it will not pass. We'll have 2 difficult years, but they will not. But they'll pass, and hopefully we can have a more vigorous debate in 2012. But I'll end there and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Jim. Turn it over to Professor Haddad.
I'm going to try and focus a little more about Islamophobia and how it has been defined, what can be done about it, and what is being done about it. There are several definitions of Islamophobia. It is a word that was coined in Europe. It's a new word in a sense, and generally speaking, to most people, it means fear of Islam. But it also means the defamation, the hate of Islam. And there are some people who argue that it is a racialized term, that it doesn't necessarily only fit the religion of Islam, but it fits people, like the first person who got killed because he was, after 9/11, was a Sikh. So it is anybody who's dark-skinned, and whose physical appearance looks like anything Islamic in what is in people's mind. I just was in Egypt last week, and on the way over, there was a group of 70 people going from basically Pennsylvania and Ohio, mostly Presbyterians, to the Holy Land. And one of them was a teacher, and she said that she just discovered that in Egypt they have cars because she thought that they had camels, okay? And this is a teacher. So that what you have is a mentality among a lot of Americans, even in the educational system, who don't know what Arabs and Muslims are or where they are. They have a Sunday school mentality of, like 2 centuries ago, what they looked like. They live in tents. That's what she thought. So the first one is this racial sort of perception of somebody who looks different is the other. The other one is really anti-Islam, anti-religion, and basically at the same time people say, well, not all Muslims are bad, but some are. And that we have to fear them. I mean, because the religion itself promotes hatred of the infidels, and it's they really don't like Christians and we are a Christian country and that kind of stuff. So it looks at it that there are moderate Muslims. But the question is, what is a moderate Muslim? As far as I can tell in these definitions, as I read this material, a moderate Muslim is one who doesn't pray. Because if you pray, you must be a fanatic. How else, could you, because you must worship this evil God who wants to consume everybody. I personally think that there is a deeper strand going on in parts of America, which I prefer to call anti-Saracenism. And Saracen being the word that Europe has used to define a Muslim. It's not so that this anti-Muslim attitude is not new. It has deep historical roots. Because if you look at the history of Europe, you will see that Europe defined itself over against Islam. Because they were just European tribes roaming around, and suddenly there was this threat from the west, from Andalusia, and from the east, from the Ottomans, and suddenly they became Europeans, and they had the Reconquista and the Crusades, and basically identified themselves as these Christians who are fighting this Saracen threat. And if you look at the literature, you'll see that Saracens feature quite a lot, and they're always the other. They're never us. And if you look at American literature, you'll find in the early parts of American history that idea came to the United States. You find it in sermons, like Cotton Mather's sermons, the Puritans, in which the idea is that the Saracens, the Muslims, are the Antichrist. So it is part of the concept of what the evangelicals today talk about as, they are part of the drama of the end of time, in which Jesus is going to come and crush them. But what is interesting is that if you look at these sermons at the beginning of American history, you will see that it's not only the Muslims who feature as part of the Antichrist, but the Pope. And the Pope has been accepted as part of America. So that if you look at the process by which Catholics have been integrated and assimilated into the definition of what it means to be American, then you can say there is hope that eventually Muslims will be too, even by the evangelical right, if they can begin to understand that we worship the same God. But what is interesting to me, I just did a paper with a friend, and I found out, all this material that the Christian right has developed about the end of times, in which, Jesus, first of all, there's going to be this war between the Muslims and the Jews in Israel, and then Jesus is going to come and crush everybody, but he's also going to wipe out all the Jews, because only 144,000 Jews will be saved, and that is only because they convert to Christianity. That is the belief of evangelical Christians. What is interesting is right now in Egypt, there is a movement which understands Islam and the drama of the end of time of Islam in exactly the same way. Whereas before, interpretations within Islam used to follow Jewish traditions in order to understand narratives in the Quran that they didn't have enough explanation of. They called them Israeliyat. Now they have what they call Nasraniyat, which means Christian narrative. And so at the end of time, Jesus is going to come, there's going to be a war, and of course Islam will prevail because Jesus is a Muslim. And in these narratives, both Jewish and, both Christian and Muslim, the Jews will be wiped out. And what they're saying is, it's not an Islamic idea, it's even a Christian idea. We're taking it from them. They quote Pat Robertson and all these various Christian fundamentalists. So they are reading this material which demonizes them and sort of reinterpreting their own scriptures and their own history and the theory of the end of time in that. Most of the people that Jim talked about are Islamophobes that we can list, and they're part of the Christian right, and I have a list of some of them. But there is also another group, which is Jewish rabbis, whose specialty is also to demonize Islam. And I've got a list of all of them. And at the same time, there are Christian ministers who attack them and Jewish rabbis who attack them. So what we have is a division within the two religions. Both Christians have a division of those who are against demonizing Muslims and those who specialize in demonizing Muslims, and the Jewish community is divided in the same way. Some promote the idea of demonizing Muslim, and some are against it. Now, the thing that's interesting is that the demonizers are definitely seeing this as an opportunity to promote Israeli interests in the United States. And as Jim noted, there is a part of the neocon. If you look at the neocon movement, you'll see that it has roots with Benjamin Netanyahu. When he was here in the United States, he started the Jonathan Institute, which brought in most of these neocons. They published books. And long before America was talking about Islamic terrorism, because at that time it was still communism, they were promoting the idea that Islam is the enemy. And Islamic fundamentalism, Islamic terrorism is the enemy. And if you look at some of the literature of the Jewish lobby, you will see that even some of the Israelis came around and said, from now on, don't talk about Palestinians or Palestinian terror, talk about Islam, Islamic terror. So there is a long-standing effort to give a religion to any of the resistance towards Israeli domination of the Palestinians. Of course, there are some professional demonizers also. They make money and they raise money. And recently, if you look at Daniel Pipes and Pam Geller, they are rejoicing because they both say, they have put out papers, we have won because we have turned America against Islam. And both of them are soliciting more money to continue their efforts to demonize. Unfortunately, there are also some native informers who are very, very useful to these people. They include Muslims who have made a lot of money by demonizing Islam. And they were sort of trotted around, here's a sample, somebody who's a Muslim. She knows what it's about. And she's telling us that Islam is this and Islam is that. And there are several of them, and they're running around, and some of them have become millionaires just from lecturing in these places and telling people what they should fear about Islam. What is being done? One of the things that was interesting to me is to look at all the various programs that have been taking place that both Muslims and Arabs have been sort of working on to try and change American attitudes. And most of them are dependent on the idea is that if you provide education and information, you can wipe out prejudice. They all believe that. And so you will see efforts, even the Arab American university professors, in the 1970s, that's what they did. They established an idea of publishing, providing information, hoping that people will learn the truth and therefore be able to understand what Arabs and Muslims are about. But the idea is that ignorance is the foundation of this prejudice, rather than there is an innate internal enmity that is there. The question is there an innate enmity? No, I don't know what's in people's hearts, but I'll tell you what has been done. For example, you have several Islamic organizations that have adopted the idea that they have to combat Islamophobia. One of them is the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and they've been pioneering in this work. They have established dialogue with Jews. When they first started, all the other Muslim organizations were against them, saying, how could they do that? But they have persisted. They have come out with statements with the Jewish community against Islamophobia, against targeting innocent people, and so on and so forth. They provide workshops and training for their young people, and they believe that truth will overcome fear. And they give packets. They've printed brochures and little booklets, and they teach their young people how to interact with the national and local media, how to forge close partnerships with interfaith and civic groups, and they provide training in leadership. They're very active in trying to produce a group of young Muslims who are able to function as Americans in an American society. So they're not seen as alien. They don't identify as alien. I remember Haddad, even in the 1980s, he was telling people, you know, if you think that your son is going to come out as an Egyptian, you are wrong. He's going to be an American with some kind of Egyptian background. And people were against him at that time, saying, you know, how could he say that? Of course my son is going to be Egyptian. But he was, from the beginning, saying, we have to become American, we have to identify as Americans, and we have to work within the system. Then there is the Islamic Society of North America. They were among the first to be recruited by the Catholic Church, and they established interfaith dialogue on the West Coast, East Coast, and in Chicago. And they continued that. After 9/11, they sort of established an office here in Washington, D.C., and they have a lot of interfaith activity. One of the criticism that has been meted against them is they're always willing to tell Christians and Jews what Islam is. They're not really as eager to learn about Christianity and Judaism because they feel they know everything. And that is one of the criticisms about all these interfaith activities that are taking place. They're very eager to tell you that Islam is pluralistic, Islam loves Christians and Jews, but they do not want to learn about Christianity and Judaism because they feel they know what they are about. They started a project which they called Twinning Mosques and Synagogues, in which they had a mosque and a synagogue exchange congregations for a while. And I know about the Denver fiasco, in which the Jewish community came in and they gave some lectures, and then there was a coup d'etat against the leadership of the mosque, and they got rid of them, and a more fundamentalist Muslim group took over and said, this is nonsense, we're not going to put up with this. So it's not that the whole community is supporting this is coming top down from the leadership. They have also participated with the National Council of Churches. I remember in the 1980s we were trying very hard to get them to do dialogue with the National Council of Churches, and we couldn't get them to come because they were not willing to collaborate with other Muslims, because the National Council of Churches acts as an umbrella organization, and they want all the Muslims to come represented by one group, and that could never happen. And now it is more open, and they're beginning to collaborate together. The Islamic Circle of North America is the latest coming to the interfaith arena. Up till 2002, they wouldn't allow a non-Muslim to speak in their organization. They didn't want any women to speak because, in fact, in 2002, they were in Ohio at the National Convention, and the vice mayor of the city came with the key to give it to them, you know, the key to the city, and she was a woman, and they wouldn't let her speak. So the year after that, they allowed women and non-Muslims to come in. So they have moved quite a lot towards working with interfaith and collaborating with other groups. I know my time is running out. I will speed up. They have started, they do a lot of publicity on buses, in the metro. Their Sacramento office set up a booth that gave out, in 19 days, they had 1,000 visitors. They gave out 500 Qur'ans, 2,000 brochures, and they're always telling people what Islam is. And of course, there is care. Most of you know probably about it. They're more interested in combating prejudice and stereotyping, but they also started to work with interfaith groups, and they have participated in various panels, and I will move on. I'm going to talk about some other things that are taking place, which are not from the organizations, but from among young people who see themselves as being American and Muslim at the same time. But the identity is very interesting. Yeah, you can identify three types, general types. I mean, there are many other types. One is to think of yourself as an Arab or a Muslim who happens to live in America. The other is to think of yourself as Arab or Muslim American. And the other is to see yourself as an American who happens to be Muslim or of Arab background. So these are people who are struggling with these identities. What happened after 9/11 is the parents realized that what they were doing didn't work. So two things happened. One is women came to the fore, and you have a lot of women's leadership in mosques that have come out, basically because the men were being targeted by the security officers, and so when the press would go into a mosque, they would give the microphone to the women. And so you have women's group meeting in mosque trying to figure out, okay, how do we present Islam to the public? And so you have study groups of trying to figure out, okay, these are the questions they're asking, how do we respond to them? But the other group is the young people. And I did a survey of some young people trying to figure out, okay, what would you do to combat the stereotypes that are going around? And the majority wanted to, and emphasized the fact that they wanted to blend within the population, but they are not sure yet how to do it. To mix more with them. Basically, their parents have raised them to think that there are some things you don't do as a Muslim. You know, some things are najis, defiling. Can you go to a party where they're serving liquor? Some are suggesting, okay, I can go and have a ginger ale. But there are some who say you cannot be in the same room where liquor is being served. They're talking about more outreach to the general public, like medical care, more soup kitchens, more funding for homeless shelters for abused women. And there are now some shelters that Muslims are funding. But they always focus on the fact that Muslims have tended to only fund Islamic charities, and now they have moved into American charities. The other thing that they emphasize is they need to learn English, because a lot of immigrants are very reluctant to learn good English, and that their parents should not be ghettoized. Now, in the recent weekend in which Jon Stewart was in town, some of the young people had jump rope with a Muslim. I don't know how many of you have seen it, but they set up some areas and had jump ropes, and they asked the regular population, come jump with us. And basically you have women with hijab turning the rope and young American men jumping. I have 185 pictures from the event that somebody sent me. They have started working on music. Now, when Muslims first started coming to the U.S., especially Islamic Society of North America, Islamic Circle of North America, they were very much against music. And now music is coming in. You have Islamic rap, Islamic rock, and even Islamic country. And there is one special one that has just come out in which, we're okay, we're just like people. You see people holding posters saying funny things. But it's something they've come up with, basically saying, we're like you, we're American, this is who we are. Of course, comedy. You have several comedy groups that are now sort of making fun of Arab and Muslim tragedy in a sense, and helping to reach out to the community. Another area that has received very little interest is that there are a lot of young people working on writing novels or poetry. And you know, two of the novels that I have used in my courses that have been very useful is one is called In Search of Fatima, which gives a very good understanding of the Palestinian tragedy. And the other one is A Girl with a Tangerine Scarf, which sort of it gives a very good idea about what it's like to grow up as a Muslim girl in the United States. But there are others. They're working with art, and more importantly, they're trying to get into journalism so that they can help shape stories about Arabs and Muslims in the United States. And the other thing is that they want people to emphasize the fact that American Muslims are serving in the military, and you know, we know that, for example, in Dearborn there is a place which is for veterans, but they're Arab veterans, both Christian and Muslim, but they're for Arab veterans, people who have served in the First World War, Second World War, Vietnam, Korea, and in all the various services. And this information is not known to Americans. They all think that Arabs and Muslims will not fight for America and American values. I'll stop and take any questions.
Thank you very much. There's just, before we go to Q&A, and let me say, thank you. Let me just say, for those watching online, if you have a question, this is the time to send it in on the chat roll or tweet at Palestine Center or hashtag PalCenter. And we'll try to accommodate those in a second. There's just one question that I wanted to push you on and see if you'd be willing to talk more, and this is for either of you, about the connection between pro-Israel lobby and pro-Israel groups and the wave of Islamophobia and anti-Arab hatred that we've seen so far. We had groups, for example, like the ADL, and it's clear where they stand on the question of Israel and Palestine, come out against the Park 51 project. We had the Simon Wiesenthal Center, who at the same time, while they're building a museum literally on top of a Palestinian graveyard, also come out against the Park 51 Center. The Emergency Committee for Israel ads, which didn't shy away from using Islamophobia in a number of different races across the country. And of course, you know, there's no doubt that when you look at some of the key Islamophobes out there that have been working on promoting this rhetoric, if you look at where they stand on Israel, it's also very clear that they are very far to the right on this issue. And so I wonder if you talk about the connection between the sort of the pro-Israel movement and the spread of Islamophobia recently, and whether or not in this sort of climate, particularly after these elections, if this will affect in any way the president's ability or the administration's ability to effectively work in the Middle East on some of the diplomatic issues that they have.
Let me start with the second part of the question. I think it will have an impact on the president. It'll make the climate in Washington more difficult. And as I said, conservatives didn't give him a break after Cairo. The day of Cairo, I was on CNN with Liz Cheney and George Allen and company, and they already had talking points prepared to combat everything he said. That rhetoric will get more harsh, not less. And there has been on that side a conflation of several issues that are, I think, quite problematic for not just the president's outreach, but for Middle East peace, and for, more precisely, U.S.-Arab relations. In that regard, the first Bush administration was not an accident. It was a fulfillment of the vision that they have of how America should operate in the world. It was the way the neocons see it. It was the way the religious right sees it, and it's the way that Ross Leighton and Dan Burton and company see it as well. And that will be the challenge he'll get. As I said, though, with John Kerry at the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate, what you're not going to see is legislation that comes out of the House doing this. But they will give him a hard time, no doubt. On the first one, I would not. I would not put these threads together. Some of the most stridently pro-Israel Democrats in the House were some of the most vigorous supporters of Park 51. Shelley Berkeley, for example, and Jerry Nadler, and even Anthony Weiner. And I suggest to you out in the lobby, we have 2 papers that our institute has compiled, 2 research projects. One we do every year, which is the voting record of every member of Congress on a range of issues, domestic and foreign, immigration, civil liberties, but also Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, et cetera. You will find the partisan divide so evident. About 60 or so members of Congress who vote fairly well, some extraordinarily well, almost all Democrats, and nary a Republican with a positive check mark across the board. The second compilation is all of the statements that were made about Park 51. And again, you see this tremendous gap between the two parties, with the exception of Mike Bloomberg and Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey, and one other who doesn't come to mind right this moment, being the only Republicans who actually did something on this in a positive way, and Republicans being very difficult on the issue. Democrats, on the other hand, divided somewhat, but as I said, interestingly enough, the most stridently pro-Israel and Jewish members of Congress being very strong on the Park 51, supportive of it. So I would not say, I would say actually that when the ADL came out with its position on Park 51, they were lambasted in the Jewish community for the position that they took. And to some extent, Abe Foxman has become a very bad joke in the Jewish community. I mean, it's like, why doesn't he just go away? And I hear that not from the Peace Now and J Street folks, but I hear it from ADL people that I run into at different interfaith meetings, who kind of, well, Abe, I mean, it's that kind of thing. They know he's doing damage to the Jewish image in the position he takes, and that was the reaction to the Park 51 position. Simon Wiesenthal Center, again, I mean, that is not representative of anything, for real. Again, there is no correlation between being pro-Israel and being Islamophobic. I would say, however, the following. If you have the unemployment rate in America and you solve the Arab-Israeli conflict, you'll deal a significant blow to Islamophobia. Number one, it will take away the fear and the insecurity and the anxiety that fuels this. I mean, here we are, we're talking about drying up the swamp, the kind of talk that happens when you talk about the Middle East. But it also will mute the religious right impact to exploit this issue. And if Islamophobia comes from anywhere, it is not AIPAC. It is the religious right. They are the bigger problem on this issue. And I think that there are too many sensitivities in the Jewish community about crossing the line. Now, does that mean that there are not Jewish leaders or Jewish organizations that cross the line? There sure are. There sure are. And it is, I had the opportunity to speak more than a decade ago, actually, at a Hebrew University forum on anti-Semitism that was sponsored by Vidal Sassoon, who invited me to speak on what I called the two anti-Semitisms. And I traced the parallelism between anti-Semitism in Europe as it began, directed at the enemy without, outside, and the enemy within. And in content and in form, the two were very similar and have continued. If you look at cartoons over the last half century against Arabs or Muslims or against Jews, you can't tell the difference if you take away the tagline and look at the faces. You can't tell the difference. And it's the same image. It's the fat banker or the oil sheikh. It's the terrorist or it's the subversive anarchist, communist, socialist, whatever. These were the two images they played out for. They were counter-civilizational forces. They didn't understand our way of life and they threatened it. What is troubling is the degree to which on both sides of this divide, I said at the Hebrew University thing, you have some Arabs picking up the anti-Semitic rhetoric from Europe and using it against Jews. And you have some Jews picking up the anti-Islamic and anti-Arab rhetoric and using it against Arabs. And that is something worrisome. It does not characterize Arab discussions about Israel, nor does it characterize Jewish discussions about the Arabs. And I think we need to be very clear about that. The bigger threats come from others, but we need to clean up our act and be very clear about that too.
I agree with most of what he said, but I'm a little more pessimistic because as I watch some of the writings of somebody like Daniel Pipes and Pam Geller, for over a year they've been saying, Netanyahu, you don't have to listen to Obama. Just wait, the Republicans are coming, and we're going to, you're going to be able to have the majority, and we're going to stop this two-state solution. So that there is, and if you look at what they are writing, they're not. I mean, as I said, there are rabbis that are against Islamophobia, but there are some that are for it. So I think that. The divisions are within the religions itself, within Christianity, within Islam, within Judaism. I think one thing that's interesting is if you look at the United States, who has defined America? If you look at melting pot, it was a Jewish person who defined it as melting pot. If you look at the definition of a country which is Protestant, Catholic, Jew, it was a Jewish person who decided that was three melting pots. Now they were religious melting pots rather than ethnic melting pots. And then you get to the 1990s where America began to be defined either as a pluralistic society or a Judeo-Christian society. It was at the time when Muslims were beginning to say, we wanted to be Jewish, Christian, Muslim. But when you begin to talk about Judeo-Christian, you have two kinds of Judeo-Christians in America, and Jim sort of talked a little bit about it. And you have Judeo-Christian nice, and they're the people who are open and welcoming and see America as a pluralistic place that has room for everybody. And you have Judeo-Christian nasty, and they are the people who see that there is an exclusive club of Jews and Christians, and it's either within the Jewish community itself that sees itself co-opting the fundamentalist Christians, or the fundamentalist Christians who see that the Jews are necessary for the historical development for the coming of the end of time. And I remember talking to one Jewish person, and I wish I knew what her name is. I don't. But I remember she said that we are the ones who have helped the blacks assimilate, integrate into America, and the Jews and the Catholics, but unless the Arabs and the Muslims give up on Palestine, we will stand against it. And thing that's interesting to me, and I was telling you about it before, I have heard in some mosques, there was one Indian Muslim, one Bosnian Muslim, and one Algerian Muslim who said that we have to give up on Palestine. It's the only way we can make it in America. Because we will never be accepted as part of America, integrated and assimilated, unless we give up on the issue of Palestine. So I'm a little more pessimistic than he is. But he was born here.
Wow. Let's take some questions. I'm sure we have a few of them. Please wait till the microphone gets to you. Do we have an online question? let's do that first, and then we'll take a few at a time here so we can accommodate as many as possible.
This question is from Ronnie Mustafa. He's on our chat room. He said, as an Arab American, I feel that Arab leaders in America dropped the ball after 9/11 in educating Americans, and that's how the hard right was able to sell Islamophobia to so many frightened people. Are there any opinions on this or anything that in retrospect could have been done differently?
Okay. And let's take a couple more from the floor and then have our guests respond together. Why don't we go right here with this gentleman?
My name is Mohammed Shinaw, the Voice of America. With the the negative role of the religious right and the inner feelings of fear instilled in the average American people, what should Arab and Muslim Americans do differently to overcome this phenomena, and what role can the United States officials do to help?
Thank you. And let's take one more maybe from this side of the room over here, and then we'll try to take a couple more in another round. I called on him.
Yes, I would be, is this on? I would be interested in both your views about this possible perspective that the cultural center near Ground Zero was bad, the reaction was terrible, but might there not have been a silver lining in that cloud that it brought to the surface all the Islamophobia so that it can begin to be dealt with, and an effort geared up, like Dr. Haddad said, for education of the American public, and that similarly the Republicans gaining control of Congress, or at least the House, could operate similarly with all this legislation you mentioned, Dr. Zogby. This gives us an opportunity to confront the Islamophobia. So I'm a little optimistic on that front.
I've never been of the school it's got to get worse before it gets better. Never. And what happened during the summer was shameful, did not have to happen. And if it had not been for a combination of Newt Gingrich, Sarah Palin, and the national media, it would not have happened. People have bad thoughts. I'm Catholic. People got bad thoughts all the time. They learn not to verbalize them. It is not necessarily a good thing that people find the freedom or the opportunity to, in a mass way, verbalize those awful, awful thoughts. We've learned to repress those thoughts when it comes to talking about blacks or talking about Jews or not making sexist remarks about women. You can have them, just don't share. But when Newt Gingrich opened the gates and took his talking points from the Islamophobic bigot, and it's not me who calls her that, she calls herself that, Pam Geller, and the New York Times gives her 2 full pages in the Sunday newspaper. Would they do that for an anti-Semitic Muslim who said, I'm a bigot against Jews? Of course not. New York Times was wrong. It was not good. Oh, that's great. They sort of brought it out into the open. Now we can talk about it. No. If they were going to do an article at all, it should have been an expose of who she is, where her money comes from, and why she's doing what she's doing. And Newt Gingrich was exploiting fear and anxiety in New York and across the country. And the Republican Congressional Committee made it an issue by saying to members of Congress, candidates running, those who even said a good thing about it, said to them, we won't give you funding if you don't change your position. And so they had to retract their statement and come out the other way. Once you create that movement and let that genie out of the bottle, it's really hard to put it back in. Better to have dealt with it the other way. Now, with regard to the first question about our Arab leaders at fault, yeah, they are. Absolutely, absolutely. I went the first anniversary of 9/11, about a week or so afterwards. 2 weeks afterwards, I was in Cairo, invited to say something, speak to the Council of Ministers of the Arab League. And I said, look, after 9/11, we had problems. I had death threats. My family was afraid. I mean, my life personally was threatened. I had to have protection for a little while from the threats that we were getting. And we had to deal with the problems that we were facing as a community. And we did. But at the same time, Saudi Arabia is being attacked, and Syria is being attacked, and Lebanon is being attacked, and the Palestinians, and Islam generally, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what are you guys doing? And you say, we need to do an information campaign. And where is it? We need to do an information campaign on Palestine. Where is it? You asked us to do polling to come up with numbers about what you need. What are you doing with it? And they failed miserably. They hired PR firms to tinker around the edge and give them a kind of a feel good that they had white guys sitting, you know, at the table, lawyers and stuff saying, yeah, we're really doing a great job for you, sir. But they did nothing. And this cancer grew and grew and grew, and then it exploded this summer. And I say that the Arab states needed to take more seriously the need to engage in America, and they did not. Israel, that didn't need, had a group, a delegation here almost every week, crisscrossing the country, going from place to place, speaking about the horror, the terror, the this, the that. People from Sderot were coming here to the U.S. and speaking in cities around the country. I remember one time an Arab who was visiting Washington said to me, I saw in the paper that Netanyahu's in Birmingham, Alabama. What's he doing down there? I said, well, there's people there. And he's talking to them. And why aren't you there is the question. So the Arabs have a tremendous responsibility for letting this down, as does the Organization of Islamic Countries, etc. I mean, the fact is that public opinion does not change unless you work to change it, and they did not. And you did have the Daniel Pipeses and company spreading this poison, and you had people exploiting that poison, and you have politicians now who know that it's a valuable tool to use in their own interest. But we, the Arab American groups, we cannot do this on our own. We can do what we can do, but where was the help that they needed to be doing? Not for us. It wasn't a question of giving Arabs any support, Arab Americans any support. It was a question of helping themselves by dealing with and providing some kind of information campaign about themselves. And they didn't do it. So I'm just, furious about that. And frankly, they've sat back. When Dubai Ports crisis happened, I was on television most of the time talking about the consequences for America, but where were they? Their PR firms told them, be calm, don't do anything, don't say anything at all. And the fact is that the President Bush came out, but by then he could not do anything on his own to help it. But where were they? Where were their spokespeople? Where were the leaders of that effort telling people about actually what Dubai Ports was all about? And the consequences were grave. Grave for not only U.S.-Arab relations, for business in the region, but also in terms of the anti-Arab sentiment that was sort of spawned by that. I actually could go on about this a bit, but I tell you that we are in a deep hole. All of us had a hand in digging it, and all of us have a hand in getting out of it. And frankly, much more needs to be done by everybody. I missed one question. Sorry.
There was the other question was what should
We're past 2 o'clock.
what should we do differently? We are running a little over. Did you want to cover that? What should we do differently?
I think one of the things we should do differently is not keep it just on the level of leadership. I mean, leadership is extremely important, but all this interfaith stuff, they get together, they sort of eat and tap each other on the back, and everything is wonderful, and they travel, and it's become sort of like a game, but it is not getting down to the level of congregations to people, the general public. It's rather an elite group that is. I mean, you have now the OIC is running it, the Muslim World League is running it, and it's being funded. Interfaith, but you're nice, we're nice, Islam is nice, yeah. But it's not reaching the people.
And once you're doing it, you don't need it.
Right.
You already admitted that there's a problem, we got to get together. It's the folks who don't do it that you have to reach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both very much. We are over on time. I wish we had more time to take more questions, but please join me in thanking our speakers today.
Just a bit of a plug. If you go to my website, you can get those 2 documents if you don't pick them up outside. And the other is my book, Arab Voices, on Amazon. You can get it. It'll answer every question you've got. And if it doesn't answer it, just give me an email question, and I'd be happy to answer anything, any question you still have. Thank you.